The dress didn't fit. Lydia could feel it gaping at the back, where Mrs. Henshaw's hurried stitches had tried and failed to gather enough fabric. The lace collar scratched against her collarbone. The hem dragged in the dust. Everything about this moment felt borrowed, ill-fitting, wrong. She stood in the small room behind the church, staring at herself in a cracked mirror that someone had propped against the wall. The woman looking back was a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed. Her dark hair had been pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Henshaw's voice came from the doorway, bright and false as a painted smile. Lydia didn't turn around. "Liar." The word came out flat. Mrs. Henshaw's smile flickered but held. "Now, Lydia, I look like exactly what I am." Lydia's reflection didn't blink. A girl being sold off to pay her father's mistakes. The older woman's face tightened. "That's a terrible way to think about marriage. Is there a better way to think about marrying a complete stranger for money?" Silence filled the small room. Outside, Lydia could hear the murmur of voices, the scrape of boots on wooden floorboards. The whole town had turned out, not for joy, not for celebration. They'd come to watch the Cross family's final humiliation play out in real time. Mrs. Henshaw cleared her throat. "Mr. Boone is a good man, respected, wealthy. You could do far worse. I could also do this willingly. That might be nice." "Lydia Cross, you listen to me." Mrs. Henshaw's voice dropped, losing its artificial sweetness. "Your father owes money to half this town. The bank is 3 days from foreclosing on your home. Your mother is sick. Your sisters need to eat. You think anyone else was lining up to help? Mr. Boone offered a solution." "Mr. Boone offered to buy a wife," Lydia cut in. "Let's not dress it up as charity." Mrs. Henshaw's mouth pressed into a thin line. "You're being childish." "I'm being sold. I think I've earned the right to be a little childish about it." Before Mrs. Henshaw could respond, the door opened wider. Lydia's father stood in the frame, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. Thomas Cross had always been a big man, broad-shouldered, loud-voiced, the kind of presence that filled a room. But debt and shame had whittled him down to something bent and gray. "It's time," he said quietly. Mrs. Henshaw slipped past him with a disapproving sniff. Lydia and her father stood alone in the small room, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down between them. "Lydia, don't." She still hadn't turned from the mirror. "Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't tell me this is for the best." "I never wanted—" "I know." Her voice cracked despite her best efforts. "I know you didn't want this, but here we are anyway." Thomas Cross took a step forward, then stopped. His hands hung useless at his sides. "If there was any other way—" "There isn't." Lydia finally turned to face him. "We both know there isn't, so let's just get through this." He looked at her with such naked grief that she had to glance away. "You look so much like your mother," he whispered. "Don't." She would have— "Don't." The word came out sharp enough to cut. "Mother's lying in bed with a fever that won't break because we can't afford a real doctor. Don't tell me what she would have wanted." Her father flinched. Lydia felt a mean, small satisfaction at causing him pain and immediately hated herself for it. This wasn't his fault. Not really. He'd made bad investments, trusted the wrong people, gotten in over his head. It was stupidity, not malice. But stupidity and malice often led to the same place. And that place was here. A borrowed dress, a stranger waiting at the altar, a future she hadn't chosen. "Let's go," she said, moving toward the door before her courage could fail. "The sooner we start this, the sooner it's over." The church was packed. Lydia paused in the doorway, taking it in. Every pew was full. Faces turned toward her, some curious, some pitying, some gleaming with the quiet satisfaction of witnessing someone else's downfall. She recognized most of them: the Hendersons, who'd foreclosed on the Mitchells last spring; the Cartwrights, who'd spread the first rumors about her father's debts; the Reverend's wife, whose smile was all teeth and no warmth. Red Hollow had turned out in force to watch the Cross family bleed. Lydia's fingers tightened on her father's arm. He patted her hand absently, like she was a child afraid of the dark, and started walking. She had no choice but to follow. The aisle stretched before her like a plank. Each step felt precarious, the borrowed shoes pinched. The too long hem threatened to trip her. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. At the end of the aisle, a man waited. Caleb Boone. Lydia had seen him before, of course. Red Hollow wasn't large enough to avoid anyone, but she'd never really looked at him. He was just another figure at the edges of her life. The quiet rancher who kept to himself, who came to town only when necessary, who spoke in short sentences and never stayed for the social niceties that followed Sunday services. Now she looked. He was tall. That was the first thing. Taller than her father, broader through the shoulders, dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. He'd made an effort to dress up, a clean vest, a pressed collar, boots without mud, but there was something fundamentally untamed about him, like trying to put a wolf in gentleman's clothing. His face was hard to read, strong features weathered by sun and wind, a jaw that looked carved from stone. Eyes that... She faltered. His eyes weren't cruel. She'd been bracing for cruelty, for the look of a man who'd just purchased something he owned. But Caleb Boone looked at her with something closer to resignation, like he was standing at his own funeral. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. It was terrifying. At least cruelty was predictable. Her father released her arm and stepped back. Lydia was suddenly alone, standing beside a stranger who would legally become her husband in the next few minutes. Reverend Matthews opened his Bible and began to speak. Lydia didn't hear most of it. The words washed over her: duty, honor, obedience, all the comfortable lies that made a transaction sound like a sacrament. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her face carefully blank. She'd learned early that showing emotion only gave people more ammunition. "Do you, Caleb Boone, take this woman?" She risked a glance at him. He was staring straight ahead, jaw tight, eyes fixed on something beyond the Reverend's shoulder. His hands were clenched at his sides. She could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He didn't want this either. The realization hit her with unexpected force. She'd been so focused on her own trapped situation that she hadn't considered he was buying a wife because something in his life was broken too. Men didn't resort to arranged marriages when everything was going well. "I will," Caleb said. Not "I do." "I will." The phrasing was strange enough that Lydia's attention sharpened. It wasn't quite a promise, more like a statement of intent, or a warning. "And do you, Lydia Cross?" Her name sounded wrong in the Reverend's mouth. Too formal, too final. "Take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, for better or worse, in sickness and health, to love, honor, and obey, as long as you both shall live?" The church went silent. Every eye was on her, waiting, watching, ready to see her submit. Lydia opened her mouth. The words sat on her tongue like poison. "I do." It came out as a whisper, a surrender. The Reverend nodded, satisfied. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife." No one applauded. The silence stretched, awkward and thick. Caleb turned to her slowly, like he was moving through water. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. Wasn't that what happened at weddings? But he just looked at her, his expression unreadable, and gave a single nod. Then he turned and walked down the aisle. Lydia stood frozen for a heartbeat before realizing she was supposed to follow. She gathered up the too long skirt and hurried after him, aware of every whisper that rippled through the pews as she passed. Sold her like livestock. What kind of father? Wonder how long before he regrets. Outside, bright sunlight made her blink. A wagon waited in front of the church. Caleb's wagon, she assumed. Plain wood, no decoration. 2 horses stood patient in the traces. Caleb was already climbing into the driver's seat. He didn't offer to help her up. Lydia hesitated, then grabbed the side of the wagon and hauled herself onto the bench beside him. The borrowed dress caught on a splinter. She heard fabric tear and didn't care. Her father appeared at the wagon's side, slightly out of breath. "Lydia, Goodbye, Father." She didn't look at him. "Please, just..." Caleb picked up the reins. The horses started forward. Thomas Cross stumbled back, his hand falling away from the wagon. "I'm sorry," her father's voice cracked. "Lydia, I'm so sorry." She didn't turn around, didn't wave, just sat rigid as stone as the wagon carried her away from the only life she'd ever known. Red Hollow fell behind them. The church, the general store, the cluster of houses that made up the town center. The road stretched ahead, cutting through scrubland and scattered pines. The sun beat down, relentless and bright. Neither of them spoke. Lydia counted telegraph poles to keep from thinking. 1, 2, 3. The wagon creaked and rattled. The horse's hooves made a steady rhythm. Caleb's hands were relaxed on the reins, his posture easy despite the rigid silence between them. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, he cleared his throat. The ranch is another hour out. His voice was lower than she'd expected, rough, like it wasn't used often. Lydia didn't respond. Another mile passed. There's a room prepared, Caleb continued, as if she'd answered. It has a lock. On the inside. She turned to stare at him. He kept his eyes on the road. I won't bother you, he said. You have my word on that. Your word. The words tasted bitter. I'm supposed to trust the word of a man who just bought a wife? Something flickered across his face. Anger, maybe, or pain. It was gone too quickly to read. I didn't buy a wife. No? What would you call it? A contract, a business arrangement. Lydia laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to make the situation clear. His jaw tightened. The town expected. There were reasons. I'm sure there were. I won't apologize for providing a solution to your father's problem. My father's problem. Heat flooded through her. Tell me, Mr. Boone, did anyone ask if I wanted to be a solution? Or did you and my father just work out the terms between yourselves? That's how these things are done. These things? She turned away, staring at the passing landscape. You mean selling people? Silence fell again, heavier than before. The ranch came into view gradually, first the fence lines, then the grazing cattle, then the buildings themselves. It was bigger than Lydia had expected. A large main house, a barn, several outbuildings. Everything looked well-maintained, prosperous. Of course it did. Caleb Boone could afford a wife, he could afford anything. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house. Caleb set the brake and climbed down. This time, he came around to her side and offered his hand. Lydia looked at it like it might bite. I can manage. She climbed down on her own, her stiff skirts making it awkward. Her foot caught on the last step and she stumbled. Caleb's hand shot out to steady her, and she jerked away so violently she nearly fell. They stood facing each other in the dusty yard. I'm not going to hurt you, Caleb said quietly. You already have. She saw him absorb the blow. His hand dropped to his side. Your room is upstairs, he said after a moment. Second door on the right. Your things arrived yesterday. I'll bring in your trunk. I'll bring in your trunk, he repeated more firmly. You look like you're about to fall over. He wasn't wrong. The combination of heat, stress, and the too-tight dress had left her dizzy and sick. But Lydia would have walked through fire before admitting weakness to him. Fine. She walked toward the house without waiting. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was dim and blessedly cool. Lydia stood in the entryway, taking it in. Clean. That was the first impression. Everything was clean, orderly, almost militarily precise. Simple furniture, no decoration. It looked like a place where someone lived, but didn't really feel at home. Stairs led to the second floor. Lydia climbed them slowly, her hand trailing along the banister. The second door on the right opened easily. The room was small but adequate. A bed with a plain quilt. A dresser. A washstand with a basin and pitcher. A window that looked out over the yard, and beyond it, endless stretching land. And on the inside of the door, a bolt lock. Lydia stared at it. Caleb had been telling the truth. She could lock him out. The thought should have been comforting. It wasn't. It just made everything feel more transactional, more cold. Here are the terms. A room, a lock, no expectations. A business arrangement. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her head in her hands. A knock on the doorframe made her look up. Caleb stood in the hallway, her small trunk hefted easily in his arms. He didn't come in, just set it down just inside the threshold. I'll be downstairs if you need anything, he said. I won't need anything. He nodded once, like he'd expected that answer, and left. Lydia waited until his footsteps faded, then got up and closed the door. The bolt slid home with a solid click. She stood there for a moment, her forehead resting against the wood, breathing. Married. She was married. To a stranger who locked her in. No, who gave her a lock to keep him out. to a man who'd paid money to solve a problem named Lydia Cross, to someone she'd have to face across a breakfast table for the rest of her life. The rest of her life. The enormity of it hit her all at once. This wasn't temporary. There was no going back. She'd stood in a church and said, "I do." And now she was bound, legally, socially, in every way that mattered, to Caleb Boone. She'd traded one prison for another. Only this one had better furniture. Lydia opened her trunk with shaking hands. Her meager possessions looked even more pathetic spread out. 2 dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush, the small Bible her mother had given her years ago. Everything she owned fit in a space the size of a coffin. She changed out of the borrowed wedding dress carefully, folding it despite never wanting to see it again. Her own dress, faded blue cotton, patched at the elbows, felt like returning to her skin after wearing someone else's. The sun was setting. Golden light slanted through the window, painting everything amber. Lydia sat in the chair by the window and watched the shadows lengthen across the land. Somewhere below, she could hear the faint sounds of Caleb moving around. Dishes clinking, water running, the ordinary sounds of someone making dinner. Her stomach growled. She ignored it. An hour passed. Then another. The light faded. Stars began to appear, more than she'd ever seen in town. Out here, away from everything, the sky was enormous and full of light. Another knock. "I made supper," Caleb's voice came through the door. "I'll leave a plate outside." She didn't answer. Footsteps retreated. A minute later, she heard him going down the stairs. Lydia waited until she was certain he was gone, then opened the door a crack. A plate sat on the floor. Bread, beans, some kind of meat. Steam still rising, her stomach clenched with hunger. She took the plate inside, locked the door again, and ate sitting on the bed. The food was plain but good, better than anything her family had managed in months. She hated that she was grateful for it. When she was done, she set the empty plate by the door and lay down fully clothed on top of the quilt. The mattress was more comfortable than anything she'd slept on in years. Another thing to resent, sleep didn't come. She lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, the distant calls of night birds, the endless whisper of wind across open land. Every sound made her tense, waiting for footsteps on the stairs, waiting for the door to rattle, waiting for Caleb to claim what the town said he'd bought. But the footsteps never came. Eventually, exhausted, she drifted into an uneasy sleep. She woke to gray dawn light and the smell of coffee. For a moment, Lydia couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came crashing back, the wedding, the wagon, the locked door. She sat up, disoriented and stiff from sleeping in her clothes. The empty plate was gone from outside her door. In its place sat a cup of coffee, still hot, and a covered basket. Lydia stared at it. Then she opened the door, grabbed the coffee, and retreated back inside before Caleb could appear. The coffee was black and strong. She sipped it slowly, letting the heat wake her up. The basket contained biscuits and butter. Her traitorous stomach growled again. This was going to be her life. Meals left outside the door like she was a prisoner, polite distance, a stranger's footsteps on the other side of a locked door. She could live like this. She'd survived worse. But was survival really all she could hope for? Lydia dressed carefully, brushed her hair, and steeled herself. She couldn't hide in this room forever. Eventually, she'd have to face the reality of her situation. Might as well be today. She unlocked the door and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but signs of Caleb were everywhere. Dishes washed and drying by the sink, the coffee pot still warm on the stove, a chair pulled slightly out from the table. Through the window, she could see him outside, working near the barn. His back was to the house. He didn't seem to be watching for her. Lydia poured herself another cup of coffee and sat at the table. The house was so quiet. Back home, mornings were chaos. Her sisters chattering, her mother moving around despite her illness, her father's heavy tread, the general noise of 5 people trying to exist in too small a space. This silence felt unnatural, oppressive. She found herself listening for Caleb's footsteps, dreading them, hoping for them. The morning crawled past. Lydia washed her cup, then stood awkwardly in the kitchen, unsure what she was supposed to do. Was there an expectation? Should she clean? Cook? Was she a wife or a guest or something else entirely? Around noon, Caleb came in for water. He stopped short when he saw her, like he hadn't expected her to be there. They stared at each other across the kitchen. "Good morning," he said finally. "Is it?" Something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "Fair point." He filled a glass from the pump, drank it in long swallows. Lydia watched the movement of his throat, then looked away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of such a small observation. "I need to ride fence line this afternoon," Caleb said, setting down the glass. "I'll be back before dark." Was he asking permission? Explaining? She couldn't tell. "All right." He nodded and turned to go. "Mr. Boone." He stopped. "Why did you do this?" The question burst out before she could stop it. Why marry someone you didn't know?" Caleb was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, he didn't turn around. "Same reason you did. Because I didn't have a choice." Then he was gone, leaving Lydia alone with more questions than answers. She spent the afternoon exploring the house. It felt invasive, but also necessary. This was supposed to be her home now. She might as well know the shape of her cage. The house was bigger than it looked from outside. Besides the kitchen and her bedroom, there was a sitting room, a study, another bedroom that was clearly Caleb's. She didn't go inside. And various closets and storage spaces. Everything was clean, orderly, impersonal. No photographs. No mementos. Nothing that spoke of family or history or any life before this moment. In the study, she found rows of books on ranching, animal husbandry, land management, a desk with neat stacks of papers, accounts, supply orders, correspondence. She didn't read them, but she could see the careful handwriting, the methodical record-keeping. Caleb Boone was organized, solitary, and profoundly alone, just like her. The realization sat uncomfortably. It was easier to think of him as the enemy, the man who'd bought her like livestock. Harder to see him as another person trapped by circumstances beyond his control. Evening came. Lydia returned to the kitchen and considered dinner. Should she cook? It seemed expected, but also presumptuous. This was his house, his kitchen. While she was still debating, she heard the horse. Caleb came through the door, dusty and tired. He stopped when he saw her standing by the stove. "I wasn't sure," Lydia started, then stopped. "Should I cook?" "Can you?" "Of course I can. I've been cooking for my family since I was 10. "Then, if you want to." He hesitated. "I usually just make something simple, but if you'd rather—" "I'll cook," Lydia interrupted. "If you tell me what you have." Relief flashed across his face. "Root cellar is out back. Pantry's there." He gestured. "Take whatever you need." She nodded stiffly. This she could do. This was familiar. Caleb disappeared upstairs. Lydia heard water running. He was washing up. She went to investigate the pantry and found it surprisingly well stocked. Flour, beans, rice, canned goods, spices. More food than her family had seen in months. She pushed the bitter thought away and started pulling ingredients. By the time Caleb came back down, hair damp, wearing a clean shirt, she had chicken frying and potatoes boiling. The kitchen smelled like home, like normal life. "Smells good," he said quietly. Lydia didn't answer, focused on turning the chicken. They ate in silence, not comfortable but not hostile either. Just the quiet of two people who didn't know how to talk to each other yet. Caleb ate with focus, like a man who usually took meals alone and didn't see the point in conversation. When he was done, he stood and brought his plate to the sink. "Thank you," he said. "That was really good." "You're welcome." He lingered by the sink like he wanted to say something else. Lydia waited. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Caleb said finally. "I know you didn't choose this. But I'll try to make it bearable, if you'll let me." She looked up at him. In the lamplight, his face was softer, less forbidding. He looked tired, and underneath the tiredness, uncertain. "Why do you care?" Lydia asked. "If it's bearable." "Because I'm not a monster, no matter what the arrangement was." "Then what are you?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "A man trying not to make things worse than they already are." He left her alone in the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Lydia finished cleaning up slowly, thinking about his words, about the lock on her door, about the distance he maintained, about the strange, careful dance they were doing around each other. She'd expected cruelty, control, demands. Instead, she'd found what? Loneliness? Regret? It was almost worse. Hatred was simple. This murky middle ground was exhausting. That night, lying in her locked room, Lydia stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a future that didn't feel like slow suffocation. She couldn't see one. Just an endless string of careful meals, polite silences, two people existing in the same space without ever really meeting. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all marriage was supposed to be. But if that was true, why did it feel like dying? The days fell into a rhythm that felt less like living and more like waiting. Lydia woke before dawn, dressed in the gray light, and came downstairs to find Caleb already gone. Coffee would be waiting, always hot, always black, always in the same chipped mug he'd apparently designated as hers. She'd drink it alone in the kitchen, listening to the house creak and settle, then begin the work of existing in a space that didn't quite feel like hers. She cooked, cleaned, kept the house in order because doing nothing felt worse than doing something. The work gave her hands purpose, even when her mind spun in circles. Caleb came in for meals, breakfast if he was working close to the house, always dinner. They ate across from each other, the table a no man's land between them. He'd thank her for the food. She'd nod. Then silence would fill the space where conversation should have been. After a week, Lydia felt like she was disappearing. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone. Each polite thank you and careful distance took a little more of her until she started to wonder if there'd be anything left. On the 8th day, she broke a plate. It was an accident. Her hand slipped while washing dishes, and the ceramic shattered against the floor in a burst of white shards. Lydia stared down at the pieces, and something in her chest cracked open. She sank to the floor and started laughing. It came out harsh and a little wild, echoing off the kitchen walls. She pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to stop, but the laughter kept bubbling up, edged with something that might have been tears if she'd let it be. "Are you hurt?" Caleb's voice cut through the noise. Lydia looked up to find him standing in the doorway, still wearing his work gloves. His face creased with concern. "I'm fine," she managed, even though she was sitting on the floor surrounded by broken china, laughing like someone who'd lost her grip on sanity. "You're bleeding." She looked down. A thin line of red crossed her palm where she'd grabbed a shard without thinking. The sight of it made the laughter die in her throat. Caleb crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and dropped into a crouch beside her. He took her wrist, gently, like she might shatter worse than the plate, and turned her hand to examine the cut. "It's not deep," he said, "but it needs cleaning." He stood and pulled her up with him, his grip careful. Lydia let herself be led to the pump like a child, watched as he worked the handle and held her hand under the cold water. The cut stung. She welcomed the sharp clarity of it. "I'm sorry about the plate," she said. "It's just a plate." "Still, I should have been more careful." Caleb dried her hand with a clean cloth, then reached into a cupboard for a small tin. He opened it to reveal bandages and ointment, the practical supplies of someone used to handling ranch injuries alone. "You don't have to apologize for breaking things," he said, dabbing ointment on the cut. "It happens." "Does it happen to you?" He glanced up at her. "What? Do you ever break things? Make mistakes? Or are you always this controlled?" Something flickered behind his eyes. He finished wrapping the bandage, then stepped back. "I make mistakes." "Like what?" "Like this." He gestured vaguely at the space between them. Like thinking a business arrangement was the same as a solution. Lydia blinked. It was the most personal thing he'd said since their wedding day. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Really, not the careful answer, the truth. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned and started sweeping up the broken plate, his movements methodical. "The town expected it," he said finally. "I've been out here alone for 5 years. Every Sunday, someone has a daughter or a niece they want to introduce. Every social gathering, I'm cornered by women trying to, I don't know, fix me, save me, whatever they think I need." He dumped the shards into the waste bin with more force than necessary. "I got tired of it, the expectations, the assumptions that because I have land and money, I must want a wife to manage my house and give me children and make me respectable." He set the dustpan down. So when your father's situation became known, and someone suggested it might solve both our problems, you saw an escape, Lydia finished. I saw a way to stop the matchmaking, to have the appearance of propriety without the... He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Without the intimacy, Lydia supplied. Without actually having to let someone in. Caleb met her eyes. Yes. The honesty of it was startling and infuriating. So you bought yourself freedom, Lydia said slowly, by taking mine. That's not... He stopped, swallowed. I didn't think of it that way. Of course you didn't. You got what you wanted. Why would you think about what I lost? I paid your father's debts, kept your family from losing everything. You thought that made it even? Heat flooded through her. You thought money made up for choice? For a future? For any say in my own life? Caleb's jaw tightened. What would you have preferred? Watching your family starve, your mother dying because you couldn't afford medicine, your sisters going hungry? Don't. The word came out sharp. Don't pretend you did this for me. You did this for yourself, and my father's debt just made it convenient. They stared at each other across the kitchen, 8 days of careful politeness cracking apart. You're right, Caleb said finally. His voice was rough. You're absolutely right. I didn't think about you. I thought about what I needed, and your father's situation made it possible, and I didn't ask if you wanted any of it because... He stopped. Because men like me don't ask. We just take what we can afford and call it fair. Lydia hadn't expected capitulation. She'd expected defensiveness, anger, justification. The admission left her off balance. So what now? She asked. I don't know. The silence that followed was different from their usual careful quiet. This one had teeth. I can't undo it, Caleb said. The marriage is legal. Your father's debts are paid. We're bound together whether we like it or not. I'm aware. But I meant what I said. About the lock, about not bothering you. You don't have to... He gestured vaguely. I won't expect anything. You have my word. Your word again. Lydia wrapped her arms around herself. You keep offering me your word like it means something, but words don't change the fact that I'm trapped here. You're not trapped. Really? Where am I supposed to go? Back to my family, who can't afford to feed me. Into town, where everyone knows I'm the girl who got sold off. I have no money, no prospects, nowhere else to be. That's the definition of trapped, Mr. Boone. Caleb flinched at the formality. What do you want from me? I want to have wanted something in the first place. The words burst out louder than she intended. I want to have had a choice. I want to not feel like I'm suffocating in this careful, polite hell where we tiptoe around each other pretending this is normal. Her voice echoed off the kitchen walls. Caleb stared at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. All right, he said quietly. All right, what? You want out of the polite hell? Then let's stop pretending. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. You hate this. I'm not thrilled either. We're stuck together, and it's awful, and dancing around it isn't making it better. Lydia blinked. What are you suggesting? Honesty? No more careful silence, no more pretending this is fine when it's not. He looked up at her. You want to yell at me? Yell. You want to tell me exactly what you think of this arrangement? I can take it. You think that'll help? I think it can't be worse than this. She studied him. The stranger who was legally her husband, who'd given her a locked door and careful distance, and apparently had no idea how to actually live with another person. You're lonely, she said suddenly. Caleb's expression shuddered. What? That's why you're out here, why you've been alone for 5 years. You don't actually want to be around people. You want them to leave you alone. She moved closer, understanding dawning. The marriage wasn't to get the matchmakers off your back. It was to have an excuse to keep everyone at arm's length. A wife means you're settled, respectable, and no one can question why you never come to town, never socialize, never let anyone close. Stop. I'm right, aren't I? Lydia sat down across from him. You bought yourself a shield, something to point to and say, see, I'm doing what's expected. Now leave me in peace. Caleb's hands were clenched on the table. You don't know what you're talking about. Then tell me I'm wrong. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. I had a family once, Caleb said finally. His voice was flat, drained of emotion. A wife. A daughter. 3 years old, with curls that caught the light. Lydia's breath stopped. Fever took them both, within a week of each other. He stared at his hands. That was 5 years ago. And yes, you're right. I don't want to be around people. I don't want their pity, or their matchmaking, or their belief that I just need time to heal and move on. I wanted to be left alone. So you married me. So I married you. He looked up, and the pain in his eyes was so raw that Lydia had to glance away. And I told myself it was different. Business, not personal. Safe. But you're here, and you're angry, and you're right to be, and I don't know how to fix any of it. Lydia sat very still, processing this new information. It explained so much. The empty house, the lack of personal touches, the way Caleb moved through space like a ghost haunting his own life. I'm sorry, she said quietly. About your family. Don't. Don't what? Don't pity me. That's exactly what I was trying to avoid. I'm not pitying you. Lydia's voice hardened. I'm saying I'm sorry you lost people you loved, but that doesn't excuse using me as a wall to hide behind. Caleb's jaw worked. No, it doesn't. And it doesn't change the fact that I'm still here, still trapped, still existing in this half-life you designed to keep yourself safe. What do you want me to do? His voice rose slightly. Release you? We're legally married. There's no undoing that without scandal that would destroy both of us. Give you money? It's already yours. Everything in this house you're entitled to as my wife. Space? I've given you nothing but space. I don't want space. The word surprised her as much as him. I don't know what I want, but it's not this. It's not being a ghost in someone else's life. It's not polite meals and careful distance and pretending we're not both miserable. They stared at each other across the table. The truth finally laid bare between them. Then what? Caleb asked. His voice was rough. What do we do? I don't know. The admission hung in the air. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the kitchen in shades of amber and shadow. Neither of them moved to light a lamp. My wife's name was Sarah, Caleb said into the dimness. She hated cooking but loved gardening, could make anything grow. The whole yard used to be full of flowers. He paused. I let them all die after she was gone. Couldn't stand to look at them. Lydia didn't know what to say to that. My daughter was Emma. She had this laugh, this complete full-body giggle that made everyone around her smile. Even when I was exhausted, even when the ranch was struggling, hearing her laugh made everything feel manageable. Why are you telling me this? Because you're right. I've been treating you like a convenience, like something I purchased to make my life easier. But you're a person, with your own losses and your own pain, and you deserve more than what I've given you. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her. I can't be what you want, he continued. I can't be a real husband. I can't. I buried that part of myself with Sarah and Emma. But I can try to be less of a coward. I can try to see you as more than just a solution to my problems. Lydia absorbed this slowly. It wasn't an apology exactly, more like an acknowledgement, a small crack in the wall he'd built around himself. I had 3 sisters, she said. I have 3 sisters. Mary's 15, Anna's 12, Beth's 8. I raised them more than my mother did because she was always sick and my father was always... She paused. Somewhere else, avoiding the reality of what his debts were doing to us. Caleb turned slightly, listening. I gave up everything for them, Lydia continued. Any chance at my own life, my own future? I cooked and cleaned and stretched every penny until it screamed. And when my father told me about the marriage arrangement, you know what my first thought was? What? Relief. The word tasted bitter. Because it meant they'd be okay. Mary could keep going to school. Anna could have shoes that fit. Beth could eat more than watery soup and stale bread. So I said yes, and I walked down that aisle and I told myself it was noble. Sacrifice. She laughed without humor. But it wasn't noble. It was just survival. And now I'm here, and they're there. And I don't know if the trade was worth it. Have you heard from them? No. My father promised to write, but... She shrugged. He's good at promises. Less good at keeping them. They sat in the gathering darkness. 2 people who'd stumbled into each other's lives for all the wrong reasons. I'll take you to visit them, Caleb said suddenly. Lydia looked up, startled. What? Your family. If you want to see them, I'll take you to town. Tomorrow, if you'd like. Why? Because you shouldn't have to wonder if they're all right. And because keeping you isolated out here is just another form of control, whether I meant it that way or not. Something in Lydia's chest loosened slightly. It wasn't much, barely a gesture, but it was the first time Caleb had offered something without being asked. All right, she said. Tomorrow. That night, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Lydia didn't lock her door. It was a small thing, symbolic, maybe even meaningless. The bolt stayed drawn back, the door closed, but not secured. She lay in bed listening to the house settle, half expecting Caleb's footsteps on the stairs. They never came. In the morning, she found him in the kitchen earlier than usual, already dressed for town. He'd made eggs along with the coffee, slightly overcooked, but edible. Figured you'd want to leave early, he said without looking at her. Get there before it gets too hot. They ate quickly, the silence between them less oppressive than before. When Lydia stood to clear the plates, Caleb stopped her. Leave them. We should go. The ride to town felt longer than the ride away from it had. Lydia watched the familiar landmarks appear in reverse. The cluster of pines, the telegraph poles, the point where the road curved and Red Hollow came into view. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't thought about facing the town again. Hadn't considered that everyone who'd watched her wedding would now see her returning with her husband, would make assumptions, would whisper. Caleb seemed to sense her tension. Where does your family live? Edge of town, small house, blue trim. Or it was blue. Probably needs painting now. He nodded and guided the horses down a side street, avoiding the main thoroughfare. A small mercy that Lydia noted and appreciated. The house looked worse than she'd remembered. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, one of the shutters hung at an angle. But smoke rose from the chimney, which meant someone was home. The wagon had barely stopped before the front door flew open and 3 figures spilled out. Lydia! Her sisters descended on her in a tangle of arms and voices. Mary, trying to maintain teenage dignity while clearly fighting tears. Anna, talking a mile a minute about everything Lydia had missed. Beth, small and fierce, wrapping her arms around Lydia's waist and refusing to let go. I thought you were gone forever, Beth said, her voice muffled against Lydia's dress. Papa said you went to live far away. Not that far, Lydia managed, her own throat tight. Just outside town. But you never came back. I'm here now. Mary pulled back slightly, her eyes moving past Lydia to where Caleb stood by the wagon, giving them space. Is that him? That's Mr. Boone. He looks scary. Mary. He does. He's just standing there like a statue. Lydia glanced over her shoulder. Caleb did look intimidating. Tall, quiet, his face carefully neutral. But she could see the discomfort in the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he kept his hands in his pockets like he didn't know what else to do with them. He's not scary, Lydia said. He's just not used to people. Their mother appeared in the doorway, thinner than Lydia remembered, leaning heavily on the frame. Lydia? Is that really you? Hello, Mama. Catherine Cross made her way down the steps slowly. Up close, Lydia could see the fever had taken its toll. Her mother's skin had a grayish cast. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear and bright with tears. My girl, she whispered, pulling Lydia into an embrace that smelled like lavender and sickness. My sweet girl, I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly sorry. Don't, Lydia said, the same thing she'd told Caleb. It's done, my... Your father, where is he? Catherine's face tightened. Working. The Hendersons gave him a job at the mill. Long hours, but it's steady pay. For now, Lydia thought, but didn't say. Her father had a gift for losing steady jobs. They went inside, all of them except Caleb, who remained by the wagon. The house was cramped and shabby, but cleaner than Lydia expected. Mary had clearly been keeping up the housework. How are things? Lydia asked, settling at the familiar kitchen table while Beth climbed into her lap. Better, Catherine admitted. The debts are paid. We're managing. Your father's trying, really trying this time. Lydia had heard that before. She nodded and said nothing. Anna produced a battered doll from somewhere. Look, I fixed her. The arm was falling off, but I sewed it back. Good work, Lydia said, examining the crooked stitches. You're getting better. Mary's teaching me. She's teaching me lots of things. Anna beamed at her older sister. Mary ducked her head, embarrassed by the praise. At 15, she was caught between childhood and whatever came next. Too old to play, too young for the responsibilities she'd been forced to shoulder. They talked for an hour, catching up on small things. The neighbor's new baby, the teacher who'd gotten married, the storm that had knocked down the Cartwright's fence. Normal, everyday details that felt precious because they were normal. But eventually, Catherine had to ask, "Are you happy, Lydia?" The question landed heavy. Beth looked up at her with wide eyes. Anna stopped chattering. Mary went very still. Lydia started, then stopped. What was the truth? "I'm adjusting." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." Catherine's face creased with pain. "If he's cruel to you, if he hurts you, he doesn't—" The words came out firm. "He's distant and awkward, and we barely talk. But he's not cruel." Distant can be its own kind of cruelty. Lydia thought of locked doors and careful meals and the vast silence of the ranch house. Maybe, but it's better than the alternative. They both knew what alternative she meant. Around noon, Lydia gently extracted herself from Beth's grip and stood. "I should go. It's a long ride back." The goodbyes were harder than the hellos. Beth cried openly. Anna extracted a promise that Lydia would visit again soon. Mary hugged her tight and whispered, "Thank you for everything." Catherine walked her to the door. "You're sure you're all right?" "I'm sure, Mama. Because if you need anything, I know where you are." It was as close as either of them could come to acknowledging the truth, that Lydia had traded herself to save them, and they both had to live with that now. Caleb was exactly where she'd left him, leaning against the wagon. He straightened when he saw her coming. "Ready?" "Yes." He helped her up onto the bench, the first time he'd offered his hand since that first awkward arrival at the ranch. Lydia took it, noting the calluses, the careful strength. They were halfway out of town when Lydia spoke. "Thank you for bringing me. You don't have to thank me for basic decency." "Apparently I do." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "They seem like good kids, your sisters." "They are." "Must have been hard, leaving them." Lydia looked at him sharply. It was the most perceptive thing he'd said. "Yes." "You can visit whenever you want," Caleb said. "I meant that. This doesn't have to be a prison. Just a cage with an open door? Better than one that's locked." She couldn't argue with that. They rode in silence for a while, but it felt different. Less like two strangers forced together, more like two people trying to figure out how to exist in the same space without destroying each other. "I don't know how to do this," Lydia said suddenly. "Do what?" "This. Whatever we're supposed to be to each other. I don't know the rules." "Neither do I." "That's not reassuring." "Wasn't trying to be reassuring, just honest." He glanced at her. "Maybe there aren't rules. Maybe we just figure it out as we go. And if we can't, then at least we tried." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even particularly hopeful. But it was something more than the careful nothing they'd been maintaining. When they reached the ranch, Lydia climbed down from the wagon before Caleb could offer his hand. She was tired, emotionally wrung out from the visit, from the careful dance she and Caleb kept doing around each other. "I'm going to rest," she said. Caleb nodded. "I'll handle the horses." Lydia went inside, climbed the stairs, and lay down on her bed fully clothed. Through the window, she could hear Caleb moving around below, taking care of the team. Normal sounds. Ordinary work. She stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a future where this felt like home instead of exile. She couldn't quite get there yet, but for the first time she could imagine trying. The invitation arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by a boy on horseback who looked nervous about approaching the Boone Ranch. Lydia took the envelope from him at the door, noting the careful handwriting on the front. Mrs. Caleb Boone. The formality of it made her stomach turn. "Thank you," she told the boy, who nodded and rode off like he was being chased. Inside, she turned the envelope over in her hands. Heavy paper, sealed with wax. Expensive. The kind of thing that came from someone who wanted you to know they had money to waste on stationery. Caleb came in from the barn as she was standing there, still holding it unopened. "What's that?" "I don't know yet." She broke the seal and pulled out a card embossed with gilt edges. Her eyes scanned the text, and her jaw tightened. An invitation. To what? Church social. This Sunday. She read further. The ladies of Red Hollow cordially invite Mrs. Caleb Boone to join them for fellowship and refreshment following services. Her voice dripped with false sweetness on the last part. Caleb's expression went carefully blank. You don't have to go. Don't I? It's an invitation, not a summons. Lydia set the card on the table. If I don't go, they'll talk. They're already talking. You know they are. The man who bought a wife and keeps her locked away on his ranch like a secret. If I refuse this, it just confirms whatever they're already thinking. Let them think what they want. Easy for you to say. You don't care what they think. You never have. She picked up the card again, studying it. But I have to exist in this world. My family is still in that town. My sisters have to walk those streets and hear whatever poison people are spreading. So you're going. It wasn't a question. Lydia met his eyes. Yes, I'm going. Something flickered across Caleb's face. Concern, maybe, or warning. They won't be kind. I know. Lydia, I know, she repeated, firmer this time. I know exactly what they'll be. But hiding out here doesn't change anything. It just makes me look ashamed. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Tell that to them. Sunday came too quickly and not quickly enough. Lydia dressed with care, choosing her best dress, which wasn't saying much, but at least it was clean and pressed. She pinned her hair up, studying herself in the mirror. She looked pale, tired, like someone bracing for battle, which, she supposed, she was. Caleb was waiting by the wagon when she came downstairs. He dressed up too, clean shirt, vest, his hair combed back. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothes, like a wild animal forced into traces. You don't have to come, Lydia said. I'm coming. The invitation was just for me. I don't care. He helped her up onto the wagon seat. You're not walking into that alone. Something warm flickered in Lydia's chest. Gratitude, maybe, or the beginning of it. She didn't trust it enough to name it. The ride to town was quiet. Lydia's hands were clenched tight in her lap, her knuckles white. She could feel Caleb glancing at her, but was grateful he didn't try to fill the silence with false comfort. Red Hollow's church stood at the center of town, white-clabbered with a modest steeple. Wagons and horses were already clustered around it. The whole town had turned out, just like they had for the wedding. Lydia's stomach churned. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of the crowd. Before he could move, Lydia put her hand on his arm. Let me go in first, she said. Alone. That's a bad idea. Probably. But if you come with me, they'll think I need protection. I need them to see I can stand on my own. Caleb's jaw worked. I don't like this. You don't have to like it. She climbed down before he could argue further and straightened her dress, her spine. Then she walked toward the church with her head high, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. The conversations died as she approached. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. Lydia kept walking. The church doors stood open. Inside, she could see clusters of women already gathering, the same women who'd watched her wedding with such avid interest. Mrs. Henderson, whose husband had foreclosed on half the town. Mrs. Cartwright, who collected gossip like some women collected china. The Reverend's wife, whose smile never reached her eyes. And at the center of them all, holding court like a queen, was Margaret Sullivan, the wealthiest woman in Red Hollow, whose late husband had owned the bank and most of the surrounding land. She was the kind of woman who used charity as a weapon and kindness as a form of control. Her eyes locked onto Lydia the moment she entered. Mrs. Boone, Margaret's voice carried across the room. How lovely of you to join us. The other women turned, their expressions a mix of curiosity and barely concealed hostility. Lydia felt like prey that had just walked into a den of wolves. Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for the invitation. Of course, dear. We were so pleased when you decided to attend. Margaret's smile was all teeth. We've been so curious about how you're settling into married life. It must be quite an adjustment. It's an adjustment, Lydia agreed, keeping her voice neutral. I imagine so. Going from your father's house to Mr. Boone's ranch, such a change in circumstances. The emphasis on circumstances made it clear Margaret meant more than just location. Mrs. Cartwright leaned in, her eyes bright with malice disguised as concern. "We've hardly seen you since the wedding, dear. Mr. Boone keeps you quite occupied out there, does he?" A few women tittered. Lydia's fingernails bit into her palms. "The ranch keeps us both occupied," she said evenly. "There's always work to be done." "Oh, I'm sure there is." Mrs. Henderson exchanged a meaningful look with Margaret. "Still, it seems strange that a new bride wouldn't want to come to town more often, unless, of course, there's a reason to stay hidden away." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Lydia could feel the trap closing around her. Any defense would sound like an excuse. Any explanation would be twisted into something ugly. "I'm here now," she said simply. Margaret's smile sharpened. "Yes, you are. And we're all so curious to know, how did you and Mr. Boone meet? It was all so sudden." "Our families made an arrangement." "How practical." Margaret's voice dripped with false sympathy. "It must be difficult being married to a man you barely know, especially one with Mr. Boone's history." Lydia's spine stiffened. His history. "Oh, you know, the tragedy with his first wife and daughter. So sad. Though I suppose that's why he needed someone new to help him forget." Margaret tilted her head. "Or did he not mention them to you?" The other women were watching Lydia like cats watching a mouse, waiting to see her stumble, waiting for tears or anger or any reaction they could dissect later. "He mentioned them," Lydia said quietly, "and I hardly think their memory is something to forget." "Of course not," Margaret said smoothly. "Though one does wonder what kind of woman agrees to be a replacement. It takes a certain flexibility of morals, doesn't it?" The words landed like a slap. Around them, the other women shifted, sensing blood in the water. Mrs. Cartwright leaned in closer. "We heard your father was quite desperate. Debts, wasn't it? Gambling?" "Business losses," Lydia corrected, her voice tight. "Ah, business." Mrs. Cartwright's tone made it clear she didn't believe that for a second. And Mr. Boone was kind enough to help, for a price, of course. "How much did he pay?" This from Mrs. Henderson, her voice sharp with curiosity. "We've all been wondering, what's the going rate for a wife these days?" Lydia's vision blurred at the edges. The room felt too hot, too small. Every face around her was twisted with judgment or glee or that particular kind of cruelty that women sometimes wielded against each other. She started, but her voice caught. "Oh, don't be embarrassed, dear," Margaret said, her tone syrupy with false kindness. "We all know the truth. Your father sold you to clear his debts, and Mr. Boone bought himself a housekeeper and, well, whatever else he needed." She paused, letting that sink in. "It's perfectly understandable. Desperate times and all that." "Though it does make one wonder," Mrs. Cartwright added, "whether a marriage based on a transaction can really be called a marriage at all. It's more of a business arrangement, isn't it?" "A transaction," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "Like buying livestock." The women laughed, polite, tinkling laughs that cut like glass. Lydia felt something crack inside her. The careful control she'd been maintaining, the determination to appear strong and unbothered, shattered. Heat flooded through her, not embarrassment, but pure white-hot rage. "You're right," she said, her voice cutting through the laughter. "It was a transaction." The women stopped laughing, surprised by her admission. "My father owed money he couldn't pay. Mr. Boone offered a solution. I agreed to marry him in exchange for my family's debts being cleared." Lydia looked at each of them in turn. "You want to judge me for that? Fine. Judge away. But at least I'm honest about what happened." Margaret's smile faltered slightly. "My dear, there's no need to be defensive." "I'm not being defensive. I'm being truthful." Lydia took a step forward. "You want to know what it's like to be sold? It's standing in a church in a borrowed dress, watching your father cry because he knows what he's doing to you. It's saying vows to a stranger while the whole town watches like it's entertainment. It's lying awake wondering if you made the right choice, knowing you didn't have any other options." The room had gone silent. Every eye was fixed on Lydia. "But you know what's worse than being sold?" She looked directly at Margaret. "Being judged by women who've never had to make that choice. Women who married for love or comfort or security and act like they're somehow morally superior because their fathers could afford to give them options." Mrs. Cartwright's face flushed red. "How dare you? How dare I what?" Tell the truth? Lydia's laugh was sharp. You're all sitting here in your nice dresses, in your comfortable lives, picking apart a girl who had nothing because it makes you feel better about yourselves. It makes you feel safe. Because if you can convince yourselves that I'm different, that I'm less than you somehow, then you don't have to face the fact that most of you are just a few bad investments away from being in my position. That's enough, Margaret said, her voice cold. Is it? Because I don't think it is. Lydia's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. You want to know about flexibility of morals, Mrs. Sullivan? Let's talk about the bank your husband owned, the one that foreclosed on the Mitchells when they were 2 weeks late on a payment, even though they'd been loyal customers for 20 years. Let's talk about the interest rates he charged people who were already struggling. Margaret's face went white with fury. Or you, Mrs. Henderson, Lydia turned. Should we discuss how your husband bought up half the farmland in this county by waiting for people to default, then offering pennies on the dollar? How many families lost their homes so you could have that new piano in your parlor? You insolent little... And Mrs. Cartwright? Lydia's voice was ice now. Everyone knows you spread the first rumors about my father's debts. You couldn't wait to tell everyone how far the Cross family had fallen. Made you feel important, didn't it? Having information. Being the first to share the bad news. The silence in the room was absolute. The women stared at Lydia like she'd grown a second head. No one spoke. No one moved. You're all so comfortable in your judgment, Lydia said, quieter now, but no less fierce. So certain of your own righteousness. But the truth is, you profit from other people's suffering. You build your lives on the backs of people who are desperate and struggling, and then you have the nerve to look down on someone who did what she had to do to survive. She turned toward the door. I came here because I thought I needed to prove I wasn't ashamed. But I realize now I'm not the one who should be ashamed. You are. Lydia walked out of the church with her head high, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Behind her, she could hear the eruption of voices, shock, outrage, scandalized whispers. She didn't care. She'd burned that bridge and salted the earth beneath it. Outside, the bright sunlight made her blink. Her hands were still shaking. Her breath came in short gasps. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. And now she was going to pay for it. Caleb was leaning against the wagon, his arms crossed. He straightened when he saw her, his eyes scanning her face. We need to leave, Lydia said. Now. He didn't ask questions, just helped her up onto the wagon and climbed up beside her. The horses started moving before she'd even settled into her seat. They were at the edge of town when Lydia started shaking in earnest. Not from fear, from the sheer adrenaline of what she'd just done. She'd spent her whole life being quiet, being good, being the girl who did what was expected. And in the space of 5 minutes, she'd torn that image to shreds. What happened? Caleb asked, his voice carefully neutral. Lydia started laughing. It came out high and slightly unhinged. I think I just destroyed any chance of ever being accepted in this town. What did you do? I told them the truth. All of it. About the marriage, about why I agreed, about how they're all hypocrites who profit from other people's suffering. She pressed her hand to her mouth. I think I called Mrs. Sullivan's dead husband a thief. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Lydia's shock, he started laughing too. Not the polite chuckle she'd heard from him before, but a real laugh, deep and genuine and completely unexpected. You called Edmund Sullivan a thief? To his widow's face? I didn't plan to. It just came out. What did she say? Nothing. I didn't give her a chance. Lydia looked at him. I walked out. Just turned around and left while they were all staring at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe you have. Probably. She felt another laugh bubbling up. They're going to destroy me for this. You know that, right? They're going to make sure everyone knows what I said, how I acted. By tomorrow, the whole county will think I'm crazy. Let them. Caleb, I'm serious. This affects you too. Your reputation. My reputation? He glanced at her. Lydia, I haven't cared about my reputation in 5 years. The only reason I go to town at all is for supplies. Let them think what they want. But nothing. You stood up for yourself. That's more than most people ever do. Lydia stared at him, trying to understand this man who seemed genuinely unbothered by the social destruction she'd just caused. "You're not angry?" "Why would I be angry?" "Because I just made enemies of the most influential women in town. Because I probably humiliated you in the process. Because you told Margaret Sullivan the truth about her husband?" Caleb's voice was dry. "Edmund Sullivan was a thief. Everyone knows it. Most people are just too afraid to say it out loud." They rode in silence for a while, the ranch coming into view on the horizon. Lydia's adrenaline was fading, leaving her exhausted and slightly sick. The enormity of what she'd done was starting to sink in. "I can't go back there," she said quietly. "To town. Not after this." "Then don't." "My family will understand, and if you need to see them, we'll find another way." Lydia closed her eyes. "I ruined everything." "Or you freed yourself from caring what they think." Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Sometimes those are the same thing." He helped her down, and this time Lydia didn't pull away from his hand. She felt unsteady, like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Inside, she sat at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands. The enormity of it all was crashing over her in waves. She'd been so angry, so focused on fighting back, that she hadn't thought about the consequences. Now they were all she could think about. Caleb moved around the kitchen, and a few minutes later he set a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked up, surprised. "Drink," he said. "You look like you're about to fall over." Lydia wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "I don't know what came over me. I couldn't stand there and let them tear me apart." "So you tore them apart first?" "That's not—" She stopped. "All right, yes. That's exactly what I did." Caleb sat down across from her. "What did they say to you?" "Does it matter?" "It does if you're going to beat yourself up for responding to it." Lydia took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "They called me a replacement for your wife. They said I was bought like livestock, that our marriage was just a transaction. They wanted to know how much you paid for me." She saw Caleb's jaw tighten, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "They implied things about why you'd want a wife, about what kind of woman would agree to such an arrangement." Her voice got quieter. "They made it sound dirty, shameful." "It's not, isn't it?" Lydia looked up at him. "A man pays money to marry a woman he's never met. That woman agrees because her family is desperate. How is that not shameful?" "Because survival isn't shameful. Desperation isn't shameful." Caleb's voice was firm. "What's shameful is a system that puts people in positions where they have to make those choices. What's shameful is the people who profit from that desperation and then judge the people they've exploited." It was the longest speech Lydia had heard from him, and the most passionate. "You sound like you've thought about this," she said. "I have. Every day since I made you that offer." He looked down at his hands. "You think I don't know what it looked like? What people would say? But your father came to me desperate, and I saw a way to solve both our problems. That doesn't make it right, but it doesn't make you shameful either. The town doesn't see it that way. The town can go to hell." Lydia blinked at the vehemence in his voice. "I mean it," Caleb continued. "Red Hollow is full of people who think their money makes them better than everyone else. They measure worth in property and influence and who you know. But they're wrong. And you don't owe them anything, not your respect, not your silence, and definitely not your shame. Easy to say when you don't care what they think. Then learn not to care." He leaned forward. "Lydia, you stood in that church and told the truth. You called out their hypocrisy. You refused to be humiliated. That takes more courage than smiling and nodding while they tear you apart. Courage or stupidity? Sometimes they're the same thing." Despite everything, Lydia felt herself smile. "You're really not angry?" "I'm furious," Caleb said, but not at you. At them. For making you feel like you had to prove something, for treating you like entertainment." They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee while the afternoon light slanted through the kitchen windows. Lydia felt the tension slowly draining from her shoulders, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. "What do we do now?" she asked finally. "Whatever we want. You don't have to go back to town if you don't want to, and if anyone has something to say about it, they can say it to me." Lydia studied him. This quiet, complicated man who'd bought her freedom with one hand while taking it away with the other, who'd given her a locked door and careful distance, but was now sitting across from her offering protection. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not making this worse." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. "Lydia, I may have started this badly, but I'm trying. I know I don't always get it right, and I know I can't fix what's already broken, but I'm trying." "I know." The words hung between them, not quite forgiveness, but something close to understanding. That night, Lydia didn't lock her door again. It was becoming a pattern, this slow erosion of the walls they'd built between themselves. She wasn't sure what it meant or where it was leading, but for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt like she could breathe. The next few days passed quietly. Caleb worked the ranch, and Lydia kept the house. They ate meals together and spoke in short sentences that were gradually getting longer. It wasn't intimacy exactly, but it wasn't the hostile silence of those first weeks either. On Thursday evening, there was a knock at the door. Lydia answered it to find a woman she didn't recognize, young, maybe 17, with red-rimmed eyes and a nervous expression. "Mrs. Boone?" The girl's voice wavered. "Yes? I'm sorry to bother you. I'm Emma Clark. I heard about what you said to Mrs. Sullivan and the others." Lydia's stomach dropped. Here it was, the backlash she'd been waiting for. "I see. I just wanted to say—" Emma took a breath. "Thank you for saying what everyone else was too afraid to say." Lydia blinked. "What?" "My father lost his farm to the bank 2 years ago. Mr. Sullivan's bank. We had one bad harvest and couldn't make the payment, and he foreclosed even though we'd been paying on time for 15 years. Emma's voice shook. "We lost everything, had to move in with my aunt, and everyone in town acted like it was our fault, like we were failures." "Emma, You're not the only one who was desperate," Emma continued. "You're just the only one brave enough to admit it. And when you told Mrs. Sullivan what her husband really was," she smiled through tears, "it felt like someone finally said the truth out loud." Lydia didn't know what to say. She'd expected anger, judgment, consequences. Not this. Did you need something?" she asked gently. "No, I wanted you to know you're not alone, and that some of us are glad you said what you said." Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Other people feel the same way, but they're too afraid to say it." She pressed the paper into Lydia's hand and hurried back to her horse before Lydia could respond. Inside, Lydia unfolded the paper. It was a list of names, at least a dozen of them. People she recognized from town, and next to each name, a short note. "Thank you for speaking up. You said what we couldn't. The Sullivans ruined my family too." Lydia stared at the paper, her throat tight. She'd thought she was alone in her anger, thought she'd burned every bridge in a moment of reckless fury. But apparently there were others who'd been waiting for someone to crack the facade of polite society. She showed the paper to Caleb over dinner. He read it slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You've started something." "I didn't mean to start anything. I just lost my temper." "Sometimes that's how things start." He handed the paper back. "People have been afraid to speak out against the families who run this town. You broke that silence. And now what? They expect me to lead some kind of rebellion? Maybe they just needed to see that speaking up won't kill you." Lydia thought about that. About Emma Clark and her father's lost farm. About all the families who'd been crushed under the weight of debt and then blamed for their own suffering. About the careful system of control that kept people quiet and grateful for scraps. "I don't want to be a symbol," she said. "Too late." "Caleb, I'm serious. Whether you meant to or not, you've become something to these people. Hope, maybe. Or proof that you can stand up to the Sullivans and Hendersons and Cartwrights without being destroyed. But I am being destroyed. I can't go back to that town. They hate me." "Some of them do, but clearly not all of them." He nodded at the paper. "And the ones who hate you? They hated you anyway. You just gave them a reason to admit it." That night, Lydia lay awake thinking about the list of names. About Emma Clark's red-rimmed eyes and grateful smile. About the weight of other people's expectations settling on her shoulders like a mantle she hadn't asked for. She'd thought speaking up would isolate her further. Instead, it had connected her to people she'd never known were there. People who'd been suffering in silence. waiting for someone to say out loud what they'd all been thinking. It was terrifying and unexpectedly powerful. Over the next week, more visitors came. People who'd heard what happened at the church social. Some brought food or small gifts. Others just wanted to talk, to share their own stories of being exploited or abandoned by the families who ran Red Hollow. Lydia listened to all of them. Heard about foreclosures and impossible interest rates. About jobs lost because someone spoke out of turn. About children going hungry while the wealthy families grew wealthier. Each story added weight to the realization that her outburst hadn't been an isolated incident of anger. It had been a crack in a dam that had been building pressure for years. "This is bigger than me," she told Caleb one evening after the latest visitor had left. "What they're describing, it's not just my father's debts or my marriage, it's systematic." "It is. So what do I do about it?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "That's not my decision to make. I'm asking your opinion." "My opinion? I think you've already done more than most people would. You stood up for yourself. That's enough." "Is it?" "It could be. Or," he paused, "or you could keep going. Use this. Turn your anger into something that actually changes things." "How?" "I don't know, but you're smart, and you're angry, and people are listening to you. That's more power than you think." Lydia absorbed that, turning it over in her mind. Power. She'd never had power before, had never even considered that she might deserve it. But here it was, tentative and fragile, but real. The question was what to do with it. She was still thinking about it when she went to bed that night. Her room felt different now, less like a refuge and more like a temporary stopping point, like she was waiting for something to push her forward. The answer came 3 days later, in the form of her sister Mary. Lydia was in the kitchen when she heard the horse. She looked out the window and saw Mary sliding off a borrowed mare, her face flushed with exertion and something that looked like anger. "Mary?" Lydia rushed outside. "What's wrong? Is Mama—" "Mama's fine. Everyone's fine." Mary was breathing hard. "But I need to talk to you." Inside, Lydia poured water while Mary paced the kitchen like a caged animal. "What happened?" Lydia asked. "You happened." Mary stopped pacing. "You and your scene at the church." Lydia's stomach dropped. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to embarrass—" "Embarrass us? Lydia, you're a hero." Lydia blinked. "What?" "Everyone's talking about what you said to Mrs. Sullivan, about how you called out all their hypocrisy." Mary's eyes were bright. "Do you know how long people have been wanting someone to do that? How many families have been crushed by those people and their banks and their foreclosures? Mary, I just lost my temper. You did what needed to be done. And now—" Mary took a breath. "Now people are organizing." "Organizing what?" "Families who've been hurt by the bank. People who've lost their farms or their businesses. They want to do something about it. Fight back somehow." Mary leaned forward. "And they want you to help lead it." Lydia sat down heavily. "That's insane. Why? You're the one who started it." "I didn't start anything. I just said some things." "You said the truth, and now people want to take it further." Mary grabbed Lydia's hand. "Lydia, this could actually change things. For all of us. For families like ours. I don't know how to lead a movement. I'm just what? Just a girl who survived being sold off to save her family? Just someone who stood up to the most powerful people in town and didn't back down?" Mary squeezed her hand. "You're exactly who should be doing this." Lydia looked at her sister, barely 15 but already so fierce, so determined. She saw herself reflected there. The girl who'd had to grow up too fast, who'd learned that survival sometimes meant doing things that scared you. "I need to think about it," Lydia said finally. "Don't think too long. People are ready to act. They just need someone to show them how." After Mary left, Lydia sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. This wasn't what she'd wanted. She just wanted to be left alone, to survive her marriage and find some kind of peace. But apparently, peace wasn't an option. Caleb found her there an hour later, still sitting in the same position. "Mary came by," she said without looking up. "I saw her leaving. What did she want?" "They want me to lead them, the families who've been hurt by the bank. They want to organize some kind of, I don't know, resistance?" She finally looked at Caleb. He was leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to say no, to stay out here and avoid the whole mess," she paused. "But another part of me, I keep thinking about Emma Clark and all those families who lost everything, and how the Sullivans and Hendersons and Cartwrights will just keep doing it unless someone stops them." "Then stop them." "Just like that?" "Just like that." Caleb moved into the kitchen and sat down across from her. "Lydia, you've spent your whole life taking care of other people. Your sisters, your family, even me in a strange way. Maybe it's time you took care of yourself by fighting for something you believe in." "What if I fail?" "Then you fail, but at least you'll have tried." Lydia studied his face, looking for doubt or concern, but all she saw was quiet certainty. "You'd support this, even if it causes trouble?" "Trouble's already here. Might as well make it count for something." She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "When did you become encouraging?" "When I realized you're braver than I ever was." He stood. "Whatever you decide, I'll back you, but don't let fear make the decision for you." He left her alone with her thoughts. Lydia sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about courage and fear and the strange path that had led her here. 2 months ago, she'd been a girl with no options, standing in a church saying vows to a stranger. Now she was being asked to lead people, to fight against the system that had crushed her and so many others. It was terrifying. It was also the first time in her life she'd had a real choice. The next morning, Lydia made her decision. She told Caleb over breakfast, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. "I'm going to do it." He looked up from his coffee, one eyebrow raised. "Do what?" "Help them. The families. Whatever it is they're trying to organize." She set down her fork. "I don't know if it'll work. I don't even know what it is yet. But I have to try." Caleb nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this. "All right. That's it? Just all right? What did you want me to say?" "I don't know. Maybe warn me about the consequences? Tell me I'm being reckless?" Lydia's laugh was shaky. Something other than calm acceptance. "You already know the consequences, and you're going to do it anyway." He took a sip of coffee. "So yes, all right." The simplicity of his response steadied her. No drama, no dire warnings, just acceptance that she'd made a choice and would live with whatever came next. "I need to go to town," she said. "Talk to Mary and whoever else is involved, figure out what they're actually planning." "I'll take you." "You don't have to." "I'm taking you." His tone left no room for argument. "You want to walk into Red Hollow alone after what happened at the church? That's asking for trouble." "I thought you said I was brave." "Brave and stupid aren't mutually exclusive." Despite everything, Lydia smiled. "Fair point." They left after breakfast, the wagon rattling along the familiar road. Lydia watched the landscape roll past, trying to calm the nervous energy thrumming through her. She was about to walk back into a town that had torn her apart, back to people who'd made it clear what they thought of her. Except now, apparently, some of those people wanted her help. The irony wasn't lost on her. Mary had given her an address, a small house on the edge of town that belonged to the Mitchells, the family the Hendersons had foreclosed on last spring. When Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of it, Lydia could see curtains twitching in nearby windows. Word would spread quickly that she was back. "You want me to come in?" Caleb asked. Lydia considered it. Having him there would be comforting, but it would also change the dynamic, make it about Caleb Boone's wife instead of Lydia Cross, the girl who'd stood up to Margaret Sullivan. "No, I need to do this myself." He nodded. "I'll be here." The house was small and shabby, paint peeling from the window frames. Lydia knocked, and the door opened immediately, like someone had been waiting right behind it. Mary stood there, her face breaking into a relieved smile. "You came." "I said I would." "I know, but I wasn't sure if you'd actually—" "Never mind. Come in." The inside of the house was cramped and dim. A group of people sat in the small front room, their faces turning toward Lydia as she entered. She recognized some of them. Emma Clark was there, along with a man who must be her father, a thin woman with work-worn hands, a couple who looked barely older than Mary, others she didn't know at all. "Everyone, this is my sister Lydia," Mary said, her voice carrying a pride that made Lydia's throat tight. Lydia, this is everyone. An older man stood, extending his hand. John Mitchell, this is my house. Or it was before the bank took it. Lydia shook his hand, noting the calluses, the permanent dirt under his fingernails. A farmer's hands. I'm sorry for your loss. Don't be sorry. Help us make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. The room murmured agreement. Lydia felt the weight of their expectations settling on her shoulders like a physical thing. I'm not sure what you think I can do, she said honestly. I don't have money or influence or… You have a voice, the thin woman interrupted, and people listened when you used it. That's more than any of us have. Mrs. Sullivan and her friends have been running this town for too long, Emma's father added. They foreclose on properties, buy them up cheap, rent them back at prices people can barely afford. It's a system designed to keep us desperate and them comfortable. I know, Lydia said, but knowing it and stopping it are two different things, which is why we need to organize. John Mitchell gestured to the group. Individually, we're powerless, but together, maybe we can push back. Push back how? There was a moment of silence. Then Mary spoke up. We're not exactly sure yet. That's why we needed you. You're the only one who's actually stood up to them and lived to tell about it. I wouldn't call what I did standing up. I lost my temper and said some things. That's not a strategy. Maybe not, but it showed people that the Sullivans and Hendersons aren't untouchable. John Mitchell leaned forward. You cracked the facade. Now we need to figure out how to bring the whole thing down. Lydia looked around the room at the desperate, hopeful faces. These were people who'd lost everything, who'd been beaten down by a system that didn't care if they lived or died. And they were looking at her like she had answers. She didn't, but she had something else. All right, she said slowly. Let's start with what we know. The bank forecloses on properties when payments are missed. Then they sell those properties, usually to someone connected to the Sullivan or Henderson families, for less than market value. Is that right? Nods around the room. And the new owners rent the properties back to people at inflated rates, keeping them in a cycle of debt. Exactly, the thin woman said. My husband and I lost our farm 3 years ago. Now we rent a quarter of the land we used to own, and we can barely afford that. So the problem is the foreclosures themselves, Lydia thought out loud. If we could prevent those, or at least make them harder to execute. The bank has every legal right to foreclose, John Mitchell said. We can't change the law. No, but we can make it politically costly. Lydia's mind was racing now, pieces clicking together. The bank needs the town's cooperation. The sheriff enforces the evictions. The town council approves the sales. If we can get enough people to refuse to participate, they'll just replace them with people who will, Emma's father interrupted. Maybe, but that takes time, and it makes them look bad. Lydia stood, starting to pace. Right now they operate in the open because no one questions it. Everyone just accepts that this is how things work. But if we make noise, if we force people to see what's really happening… Public pressure, Mary said, understanding dawning in her eyes. Make it shameful to participate in the foreclosures. Exactly. And not just shameful, risky. If enough people band together to support families facing foreclosure, it becomes harder to execute them. Lydia turned to John Mitchell. When the bank foreclosed on your farm, did anyone try to stop it? No. Most people were too afraid of losing their own property, or they believed the bank's story that we'd mismanaged our finances. So we changed the narrative. We show people that anyone could be next, that the bank isn't foreclosing because families are irresponsible. They're foreclosing because it's profitable. The room was silent, everyone processing this. Then Emma spoke up. How do we prove that? The bank's records aren't public. No, but the sales are. The town keeps records of all property transfers. Lydia's heart was beating faster. If we could show a pattern, that the same families keep buying up foreclosed properties, that the prices are suspiciously low, that the timing is coordinated, people would see it's not about bad luck or poor management, Mary finished. It's about systematic exploitation. It's a start, John Mitchell said slowly. But even if we prove it, what then? The people profiting from this system aren't going to stop just because we point out what they're doing. No, Lydia agreed. But their power comes from social acceptance, from the town's cooperation. If we can turn public opinion against them, make it clear that we see what they're doing and we're not going to tolerate it anymore. They lose their legitimacy, the thin woman said, and their ability to operate freely, Lydia added. It won't fix everything, but it's something. The group looked at each other, hope and uncertainty warring on their faces. Finally, John Mitchell stood and extended his hand to Lydia. All right, let's do it. Over the next hour, they hammered out a plan. Emma's father would start collecting data on foreclosures and property sales from the town records. John Mitchell would organize a list of families currently at risk of foreclosure. The thin woman, whose name was Helen, would spread the word quietly, recruiting more people to their cause without alerting the Sullivan or Henderson families. And Lydia would be the voice, the one who spoke publicly, who confronted the powerful, who refused to be silenced. It was terrifying and strangely exhilarating. When she finally left the Mitchell house, the sun was high overhead. Caleb was still waiting by the wagon, exactly where she'd left him. He looked up as she approached. How did it go? I think I just joined a rebellion. His mouth quirked. How very like you. On the ride back to the ranch, Lydia filled him in on the plan. He listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. It's risky, he said when she finished. The Sullivans won't take this lying down. I know. They could make things very difficult. For you, for your family, for anyone associated with this. I know that too. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. I want to help. Lydia turned to look at him. What? The plan. I want to help. He kept his eyes on the road. I have resources, land, money, influence, such as it is. If you're going to take on the most powerful families in the county, you'll need backing. Caleb, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. He glanced at her. Besides, you're my wife. What affects you affects me, and I've never liked the way the Sullivans and Hendersons operate anyway. Something warm spread through Lydia's chest. She and Caleb had been circling each other for weeks, testing boundaries, slowly building something that might eventually resemble trust. This felt like a turning point. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded, and they rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Over the next 2 weeks, the rebellion took shape. Emma's father presented them with records showing that over the past 5 years, 70% of foreclosed properties had been purchased by just 3 families, the Sullivans, the Hendersons, and the Cartwrights. The prices paid were consistently 30 to 40% below market value. And in almost every case, the properties were rented back to farmers or townspeople within months, at rates that kept them perpetually in debt. The pattern was undeniable. It was a system designed to transfer wealth from the struggling to the already wealthy. John Mitchell's list revealed that 8 families were currently facing foreclosure, 8 families who would lose everything unless something changed. Helen had quietly recruited 24 supporters, people who were willing to stand publicly against the foreclosures, even at personal risk. And Lydia had written it all down, organizing the information into a clear, damning narrative that showed exactly how Red Hollow's most respected families had been systematically exploiting their neighbors. We need to make this public, she said at their 3rd meeting, held again at the Mitchell house. Put it somewhere everyone can see it. The town square? Mary suggested. Too easy to take down, and the sheriff would probably arrest whoever posted it. What about the church? Emma asked. The bulletin board there. Everyone sees it on Sunday. Same problem. The Reverend would tear it down immediately. They sat in frustrated silence. Then Caleb, who'd been listening quietly from the back of the room, spoke up. Print it. Everyone turned to look at him. There's a printing press in Cottonwood, the next town over. Print the information as a pamphlet. Distribute it throughout Red Hollow and the surrounding county. He leaned forward. They can tear down one posting, but they can't stop hundreds of pamphlets. That would cost money, John Mitchell said slowly. I'll pay for it. The room erupted in startled murmurs. Lydia stared at her husband. Caleb, that's necessary, he cut her off. If you're going to do this, do it right. Make sure everyone sees the truth. But the Sullivans will know you're involved. They'll retaliate. Let them try. There was steel in his voice that Lydia had never heard before. She realized suddenly that Caleb had his own grievances against Red Hollow's ruling families, his own reasons for wanting to see them brought down. All right, she said, we print it. 3 days later, Lydia and Caleb rode to Cottonwood with the manuscript. The printer was a grizzled man named Harris who asked no questions and promised discretion, for a price which Caleb paid without hesitation. It'll be ready in a week, Harris said, examining the pages. How many copies? Lydia looked at Caleb. He looked back at her. 500, she said. Harris whistled low. That'll cause a stir. That's the idea. The ride back to Red Hollow felt weighted with significance. They'd crossed a line. This wasn't just angry words or private organizing anymore. This was open warfare against the most powerful people in the county. Are you scared? Caleb asked. Terrified, Lydia admitted. You? Same. They looked at each other and started laughing, the slightly unhinged laughter of people who'd committed to something dangerous and couldn't back out now. That night, lying in her unlocked room, Lydia thought about how far she'd come. 2 months ago, she'd been a girl with no choices, saying "I do" to a stranger in a borrowed dress. Now she was planning to take down the town's elite, backed by that same stranger who'd somehow become her ally. Life was strange like that. The pamphlets arrived exactly 1 week later. Caleb brought them back from Cottonwood in the wagon, boxes of them stacked in the bed. Lydia opened one with trembling hands. The title was simple, The Truth About Red Hollow's Foreclosures. Below it, in clear, precise language, was everything they'd discovered. Names, dates, properties, prices, the undeniable pattern of exploitation. And at the bottom, a call to action. It's time to demand accountability. It's perfect, Mary breathed, reading over Lydia's shoulder. It's damning, John Mitchell corrected. The Sullivans are going to lose their minds. Good, Lydia said. Her hands had stopped shaking. Let them. They distributed the pamphlets that night, under cover of darkness. Lydia, Mary, Emma, and a dozen others slipped through Red Hollow, leaving pamphlets on doorsteps, tucked into fence posts, stuffed into every visible crack and crevice. By morning, the town would be papered with the truth. Caleb stayed with the wagon, keeping watch. When Lydia returned from her route, breathless and exhilarated, he was waiting. It's done, she said. No. It started. He was right. By noon the next day, all hell had broken loose. Lydia heard about it from Helen, who came to the ranch in a state of barely contained excitement. The whole town is talking, she said, pacing Lydia's kitchen. Everyone's read the pamphlets. People are angry, really angry. The Sullivans tried to claim it was all lies, but too many people recognize the names, the properties. They can't deny it. What about the families facing foreclosure? That's the best part. The Hendersons were supposed to evict the Martins this morning, but when the sheriff showed up, there were 30 people blocking the door, just standing there, refusing to move. Helen's eyes shone. The sheriff didn't know what to do. He left without executing the eviction. Lydia felt her heart jump. It's working. It's working, Helen confirmed. But Lydia, Margaret Sullivan is looking for you. She's furious. She's telling everyone that you're going to pay for this. Let her look. You don't understand. She's powerful, connected. She could make your life very difficult. My life is already difficult, Lydia pointed out. At least now I'm fighting back. After Helen left, Caleb found Lydia standing at the window, staring out at the land. You heard? She asked without turning. I heard. Margaret Sullivan wants my head on a platter. Among other things, I imagine. Lydia turned to face him. Are you worried? Yes, but not enough to think we should stop. We could lose everything. We could. Caleb moved closer. But we could also win. And even if we don't, at least we'll have tried. That counts for something. Lydia studied his face, this man she'd married in desperation, who'd become something like a partner in the weeks since. When did you get so brave? I'm not brave. I'm just tired of watching people suffer because no one will stand up to the people causing it. He paused. And maybe I'm tired of being alone, of keeping everyone at arm's length because it's safer than caring. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Lydia felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The beginning of something real. We're in this together then, she said. Together, Caleb agreed. The confrontation came 2 days later. Lydia was in town, meeting with John Mitchell, to discuss next steps, when Margaret Sullivan's carriage pulled up outside. The older woman descended like a queen granting an audience, her face tight with barely controlled fury. Lydia Cross, she said, ignoring the Boone surname entirely. We need to talk. I don't think we do. Oh, but we do. Margaret's smile was all sharp edges. You've caused quite a disturbance with your little pamphlets, making wild accusations, stirring up trouble. The accusations aren't wild. They're documented. Documented by whom? Some disgruntled farmers who failed to manage their own affairs? A small crowd was gathering. Lydia could see people stopping to watch, drawn by the promise of drama. Documented by the town's own records, Lydia said clearly, making sure her voice carried. Property sales are public information, Mrs. Sullivan. Anyone can see the pattern if they bother to look. What you call a pattern is simply good business. Buying undervalued properties and making them profitable again, that's not exploitation, it's enterprise. And when those properties are only undervalued because your husband's bank foreclosed on families at the first sign of trouble, when you buy them for pennies on the dollar and rent them back at prices people can barely afford, what do you call that? Margaret's face flushed red. I call it the natural order of things. Some people are meant to succeed, and others aren't. That's not exploitation. That's reality. No, Lydia said. That's cruelty dressed up as economics. The crowd murmured. Margaret's eyes flashed. You've overstepped, girl. You think because my husband is dead I can't defend our legacy? You think because you married a rancher with some money you're untouchable? She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. I can destroy you, your family, everyone who helped you with this ridiculous crusade. One word from me and what? Lydia didn't back down. You'll foreclose on more properties? Evict more families? You were already doing that. The only difference now is that everyone can see what you're doing. You little... I'm done being intimidated by you. Lydia's voice rang out clear. You had your say at the church social. You tried to humiliate me, shame me, make me feel small. And maybe I did feel small for a while, but then I realized something. She looked around at the gathered crowd, meeting their eyes. You have power because we gave it to you, because we stayed quiet when you exploited us, because we accepted your version of reality instead of questioning it. But that's over now. We see you for what you are, and we're not going to be silent anymore. Margaret Sullivan stood frozen, her face a mask of rage and disbelief. She'd probably never been spoken to like this in her life, certainly not by someone like Lydia, who had no money, no family name, no social standing. You'll regret this, Margaret said finally. Maybe, Lydia agreed, but I'd regret staying silent more. Margaret climbed back into her carriage and rode away, her departure followed by absolute silence. Then, slowly, the crowd began to disperse, but not before Lydia saw approval on several faces. Nods of agreement. Small, tight smiles. They'd witnessed Margaret Sullivan lose a fight, and that changed something fundamental about the balance of power in Red Hollow. John Mitchell appeared at Lydia's elbow. That was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. She meant what she said about destroying you. I know. Lydia took a deep breath. But we can't back down now. If we do, everything we've built falls apart. So we keep going. We keep going. That evening, Lydia told Caleb about the confrontation. He listened with a deepening frown. Margaret Sullivan doesn't make idle threats. I know. She could come after the ranch, find some legal pretext to cause trouble. I know that too. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and left the room. Lydia heard him moving around upstairs, the sound of a drawer opening and closing. When he came back down, he was carrying a thick folder. What's that? Insurance. He set the folder on the table. The deed to the ranch, property records, financial documents, everything that proves this land is mine, free and clear. Lydia stared at the folder. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to know, whatever Margaret Sullivan tries, she can't touch this place. The ranch is paid for. No debts, no mortgages, nothing she can leverage. He paused. And I want you to know something else. He pulled out a single document from the folder. Lydia's eyes widened as she read it. It was a property deed for 200 acres of the Boone Ranch, and the name on it wasn't Caleb Boone, it was Lydia Boone. What is this? Half the ranch. In your name. Water rights, grazing rights, everything. Caleb's voice was steady. I had the papers drawn up last week. I just needed to give them to you. I don't understand. You're not my property, Lydia. You never were. This marriage started as a transaction, but that's not what it has to stay. He met her eyes. You deserve to own something, to have security that doesn't depend on me or anyone else. So here it is. Lydia looked down at the deed, her hands trembling. 200 acres. Independence. Freedom. Why? She whispered. Because you earned it. Because you're fighting for other people's rights while giving up your own. Because... He paused. Because you deserve a choice in everything, including this marriage. Caleb, I'm not asking you to stay. I'm giving you the means to leave if you want to, or to stay because you choose to, not because you have nowhere else to go. Lydia felt tears prickling at her eyes, the first real tears she'd allowed herself since the wedding. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of something she couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or gratitude. Or the overwhelming recognition that someone finally saw her as more than a problem to solve, or a role to fill. I don't know what to say, she managed. You don't have to say anything. Just think about it. He left her alone with the deed, with the weight of choices she'd never thought she'd have. That night, Lydia didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the deed in front of her, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The wedding, the locked door, the slow, painful process of learning to trust someone who'd started as a stranger, and Caleb's words, "You're not my property." In that moment, something crystallized, a decision that had been forming for weeks without her fully realizing it. She stood and walked upstairs carrying the deed with her. Caleb's door was closed, but not locked. Lydia knocked softly. "Come in." He was sitting at the small desk by his window, paper spread in front of him. He looked up, surprised to see her. "I've been thinking," Lydia said. About? About choices? About what I want." She took a deep breath. "And I want to stay." Caleb went very still. "You don't have to decide now." "I'm not deciding now. I decided weeks ago. I just didn't know it until tonight." She moved closer. "This thing we're doing, standing up to the Sullivans, fighting for the people Red Hollow has forgotten, I can't do it alone. And I don't want to." "Lydia, I'm not saying I love you," she interrupted. "I don't know if I'm there yet, but I know I don't want to leave. I know that when Margaret Sullivan threatened to destroy me, my first thought was that I needed to tell you. I know that this place," she gestured around them, "feels more like home than anywhere I've ever been." She held up the deed. "Thank you for this. For seeing me as more than what everyone else does. But I don't need to own land to stay. I just need to know that you see me as a partner, as someone with a voice in how we live." Caleb stood slowly. "I do see you that way. Then that's enough. For now." They stood there in the dim light, the space between them charged with possibility. Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he took her hand, a simple touch, but waited with everything unspoken between them. "We're going to face hell for this," he said quietly. "Margaret Sullivan won't stop. Neither will the Hendersons or Cartwrights. They'll come after us with everything they have." "I know." "And you're still willing to fight?" "I'm still willing to fight." His hand tightened on hers. "Then we fight together." Margaret Sullivan's retaliation came swiftly and predictably. Within 3 days of their confrontation, stories began circulating through Red Hollow, vicious rumors designed to destroy Lydia's credibility and isolate her supporters. She was unstable, the whispers said. A bitter woman taking out her resentment on respectable families. Her marriage was a sham. Everyone knew Caleb Boone kept her at the ranch against her will. The pamphlets were full of lies and distortions, manipulated to make honest business people look like villains. Helen brought word of it to the ranch, her face tight with worry. "It's bad, Lydia. People who were starting to believe us are wavering. Margaret's convinced half the town that you're making everything up out of spite." "What about the records? The proof?" "She's claiming the records were misinterpreted, that foreclosures are normal business practice, and you're twisting facts to suit your agenda." Helen wrung her hands. "And some people are believing her. She's too powerful, has too much influence." Lydia felt a familiar surge of frustration. They'd exposed the truth, put the evidence in front of everyone, and still Margaret Sullivan could twist the narrative through sheer force of will and social power. "We need to do something bigger," Mary said. She'd come with Helen, her young face set with determination. Something she can't spin or deny. Like what? Lydia asked. Show people directly, make it impossible to ignore. Mary leaned forward. The Hendersons are still trying to evict the Martins. What if we didn't just block the door this time? What if we made it an event? Invited everyone in town to witness what actually happens during a foreclosure. Caleb, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. That's dangerous. The sheriff could arrest everyone involved. Let him try, Mary shot back. Arresting 30 people for peacefully observing a legal proceeding? That would prove our point better than any pamphlet. Lydia looked at her sister with new respect. Somewhere between childhood and now, Mary had developed a tactical mind. It could work, she said slowly, but we'd need to be smart about it. Nonviolent, completely lawful. We're not there to stop the eviction, we're there to witness it, to make sure everyone sees exactly what happens when a family loses everything. And we document it, Helen added, catching on. Write down every word, every action, then publish a full account. Margaret will say we're exaggerating. Then we bring witnesses, dozens of them. People she can't discredit all at once. Mary's eyes were bright. Make it impossible for her to control the story. Over the next week, they organized quietly. Word spread through their network of supporters. The Martin eviction was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 9 in the morning. Anyone who wanted to bear witness was invited to attend. Lydia didn't know how many would actually show up. It was one thing to read a pamphlet in private, another to publicly align yourself against the town's most powerful families. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold. Lydia dressed carefully, her stomach churning with nerves. Caleb waited by the wagon, his expression grim. You don't have to do this, he said for the third time. Yes, I do. If the sheriff arrests you, then you'll bail me out. She climbed onto the wagon seat. We've been over this, Caleb. I'm going. He didn't argue further, just guided the horses toward town. The Martin house came into view and Lydia's breath caught. There were people everywhere, at least 50 of them, maybe more, standing in quiet clusters around the property. Not blocking access, not making threats, just standing there, bearing witness. John Mitchell saw them and hurried over. Everyone's here, even people I didn't expect. Lydia scanned the crowd and recognized faces from all over Red Hollow and the surrounding farms. Some were families they'd documented in the pamphlets. Others were people she'd never met, drawn by curiosity or conscience. And standing to one side, looking deeply uncomfortable, was the sheriff. He approached Lydia with a frown. Mrs. Boone, what's going on here? We're observing a legal proceeding, Sheriff. That's not a crime, is it? You're intimidating the bank's representatives. We're standing in a public space, peacefully. No one's being threatened or prevented from doing their job. She kept her voice level. Unless you're saying citizens don't have the right to observe how their laws are enforced? The sheriff's frown deepened. He knew she was right. There was nothing illegal about what they were doing, but the optics were terrible for him, caught between the crowd and his obligation to enforce the eviction. A carriage arrived, and Richard Henderson stepped out, his face florid with anger. He took one look at the assembled crowd and rounded on the sheriff. What is this? Clear these people out immediately. On what grounds? Lydia called out loud enough for everyone to hear. We're not breaking any laws. You're trespassing on private property. We're on the public road. She gestured at the crowd. Every single person here is standing on public land or land they have permission to be on. You want to evict the Martins? Go ahead. We're just here to watch. Henderson's face went from red to purple. This is harassment. Sheriff, arrest them. For what crime? The sheriff looked deeply unhappy. They're not doing anything illegal. They're, Henderson sputtered, unable to articulate a legal basis for removing peaceful observers. From inside the house, Lydia could see faces at the window, the Martin family, watching this unfold. Mrs. Martin was crying. The children looked terrified. Mr. Henderson, Lydia said, pitching her voice to Carrie, why don't you explain to everyone here why the Martins are being evicted? I'm sure they'd love to hear the bank's reasoning. Henderson glared at her. They failed to make their mortgage payments. That's reason enough. How many payments did they miss? That's private banking business. One, Mrs. Martin called from the doorway. Her voice shook, but it was audible. We missed one payment after my husband broke his leg and couldn't work the harvest. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One payment, Lydia repeated. And rather than work out a payment plan, rather than give them time to recover from a medical emergency, the bank chose to foreclose. Is that right, Mr. Henderson? The contract is clear. Miss a payment, face the consequences. And what happens to this property after the Martins are evicted? She didn't wait for him to answer. It'll be sold at auction, probably to someone connected to your family, for less than half its value. Then you'll rent it back to farmers at rates they can barely afford. It's the same pattern we documented in the pamphlets. Those pamphlets are full of lies. Are they? Lydia turned to address the crowd. How many of you have lost property to the bank? How many know families who have? Hands went up, more than Lydia expected, a wave of them across the crowd. And how many of those properties were bought by the Hendersons, Sullivans, or Cartwrights? Nearly every hand stayed up. Henderson's face contorted with rage. This is slander! I'll sue you for... For what? Asking questions? Pointing out public records? Lydia felt a strange calm settling over her. Sue me if you want, Mr. Henderson, but first, explain to all these people why I'm wrong. Show us the evidence that proves the bank isn't systematically profiting from people's desperation. He couldn't. They both knew it. The silence stretched, heavy with tension. Finally, the sheriff stepped forward. Mr. Henderson, perhaps this eviction should be postponed until tempers cool down. Postponed? Absolutely not. I have every legal right. You do, the sheriff agreed. But I'm not sure it's wise to proceed right now. Not with this many witnesses. He lowered his voice, but not enough that the nearest people couldn't hear. This turns into a spectacle. It reflects badly on everyone. Give it a week. Let things settle. Henderson looked around at the crowd. Dozens of faces staring back at him with expressions ranging from hostility to simple curiosity. For the first time, Lydia saw uncertainty flicker across his features. He was outnumbered, and he knew it. Fine, he spat. 1 week, but this doesn't change anything. The Martins will be evicted, and all of you... He swept his arm across the crowd. Will learn that the law protects property rights, not rabble-rousers. He climbed back into his carriage and left, the wheels kicking up dust. The crowd erupted in cheers. Lydia stood frozen, barely able to process what had just happened. They'd won. Not permanently, not conclusively, but they'd forced one of Red Hollow's most powerful men to back down. In public, in front of witnesses. John Mitchell clapped her on the shoulder, grinning. That was incredible. That was temporary, Lydia corrected, though she was smiling too. He'll be back in a week. Maybe, but now everyone's seen what we've been saying is true. That these evictions aren't about business, they're about power. He looked at the dispersing crowd. You've given people hope. That matters. Over the next few days, the story spread through the county like wildfire. The confrontation at the Martin house became legend in the telling. Lydia standing up to Richard Henderson, the crowd of witnesses, the sheriff's reluctant intervention. Each retelling added details, drama, significance. And with each retelling, more people started paying attention. Letters arrived at the ranch from families in neighboring towns, asking how they could organize similar actions. The group that had started as a dozen desperate people in John Mitchell's cramped house grew to 50, then 100, then more than Lydia could keep track of. What had begun as one woman's anger had become a movement. It terrified her, and energized her in equal measure. You realize there's no going back from this, Caleb said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. I know. Margaret Sullivan is planning something. I can feel it. He glanced at her. She won't let this stand. Let her plan. Lydia leaned back in her chair. We're not stopping. I'm not suggesting we should, just warning you that whatever comes next will be worse than anything so far. He was right, of course. Margaret Sullivan didn't accept defeat gracefully. The blow came a week later in the form of a letter delivered by courier to the ranch. Lydia opened it with Caleb reading over her shoulder. It was an invitation, formal, elegantly worded, dripping with false courtesy. Margaret Sullivan was hosting a gathering at her home to discuss the recent unpleasantness in Red Hollow and find a path forward that serves everyone's interests. She was inviting Lydia, Caleb, John Mitchell, and several other leaders of their movement. It's a trap, Caleb said immediately. Of course it's a trap. Lydia set down the letter. But we have to go anyway. Why? Because refusing makes us look afraid. And because whatever she's planning, I'd rather walk into it prepared than be caught off guard later. Caleb didn't argue, but his jaw was tight with concern. The gathering was set for the following Saturday afternoon. Lydia dressed in her best, which still wasn't much, but she wore it with her head high. Caleb wore his formal clothes, looking uncomfortable but determined. John Mitchell met them at the Sullivan house, along with Helen and Emma's father. They stood together on the wide porch facing the imposing door. "Ready?" John asked. "No," Lydia admitted, "but let's do it anyway." Inside, Margaret Sullivan's home was everything Lydia expected. Ornate, expensive, designed to intimidate. They were led to a formal sitting room where Margaret waited, flanked by Richard Henderson and Patricia Cartwright, the three most powerful people in Red Hollow, united against them. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, her smile sharp as glass. "Please, sit." They sat. The two groups faced each other across an antique coffee table worth more than most families earned in a year. "I'll be direct," Margaret continued. "This situation has gotten out of hand. The pamphlets, the protests, the general disruption to our town's peace. It needs to stop." "Then stop foreclosing on families for minor infractions," Lydia said calmly. "The bank has every legal right. We're not debating legality. We're debating morality." Lydia met Margaret's eyes. "You can do something and have it be legal. That doesn't make it right." Margaret's smile tightened. How naive. You think morality governs how the world works? It's power, my dear. Money and influence. And you have neither. Actually, Caleb spoke up quietly. She has both now. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. Lydia recognized it immediately, the deed he'd given her. Her 200 acres. "What's that?" Henderson demanded. "Proof that Lydia owns half of the Boone Ranch. Water rights, grazing rights, full legal ownership." Caleb's voice was steady. "She's not some poor girl you can intimidate anymore. She's a landowner, with all the rights and protections that entails." The room went silent. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she absorbed this information. "And the influence?" Patricia Cartwright asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "What influence could she possibly have?" "The support of over 100 families in this county," John Mitchell answered. "People who've organized, who communicate, who vote. That's influence, Mrs. Cartwright." "Rabble," Henderson scoffed. "Citizens," Helen corrected, "with voices and the willingness to use them." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "This is pointless. You're trying to intimidate us with numbers, but at the end of the day, we control this town. The bank, the businesses, the land. You can protest all you want. It changes nothing." "Then why are we here?" Lydia asked. "If you're so confident in your power, why invite us to negotiate?" The question hung in the air. Margaret's jaw worked, her carefully constructed superiority slipping. "Because," she said finally, each word clipped with fury, "you're making business difficult. Banks in other counties are asking questions about our practices. Families are defaulting on purpose, expecting public sympathy to save them. You've created chaos." "We've created accountability," Lydia corrected. "Something Red Hollow should have had years ago. So here's my offer." Margaret leaned forward. "Stop the protests, stop the pamphlets, stop organizing against us. In return, we'll consider more lenient terms for future foreclosures." "Consider?" John Mitchell laughed. "That's your offer? We disband our movement in exchange for you considering being slightly less exploitative?" "It's more than you'll get by continuing this fight," Henderson said. "We can make life very difficult for anyone associated with your little rebellion." "You can try," Caleb said, "but we're prepared for that." Margaret's eyes flashed. Are you? Are you prepared for the bank to call in loans early? For businesses to refuse service to anyone who's supported you? For the sheriff to suddenly find violations on properties owned by your allies?" "That sounds like threats, Mrs. Sullivan," Lydia said quietly. "And threats mean you're scared." "I'm not." "You are." Lydia stood and the others followed. "Because for the first time in your life, people aren't quietly accepting your version of how things should be. They're questioning, organizing, fighting back, and you don't know how to handle it." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Here's our offer. The bank implements fair lending practices, payment plans for families facing hardship, no more foreclosures for single missed payments, no more selling properties to your friends and family at below market rates." Her voice was steel. "In return, We'll stop making your business practices public knowledge across the entire county. Margaret's face went white with rage. You're blackmailing me? I'm offering you a choice. The same choice you've given desperate families for years. Lydia smiled without warmth. Doesn't feel good, does it? Being backed into a corner? They left Margaret Sullivan sitting in her ornate parlor, speechless with fury. Outside, John Mitchell let out a breath that was half laugh, half disbelief. That was either brilliant or suicidal. Probably both, Lydia agreed. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. But it needed to be said. What happens now? Helen asked. Now we wait, Caleb said, and prepare for whatever they throw at us next. What came next wasn't retaliation. It was silence. Days passed with no response from Margaret Sullivan or her allies. No threats, no counteroffers, nothing. The quiet was more unnerving than any attack would have been. Then, 2 weeks after their confrontation, word came that the bank had announced new lending policies. Payment plans for families in temporary hardship, a review process before any foreclosure could proceed, restrictions on who could purchase foreclosed properties and at what price. It wasn't everything they demanded, but it was something. A crack in the system they'd been fighting. They're protecting themselves, John Mitchell said when they gathered to discuss it. Making enough changes to look reasonable, hoping we'll back off. Will we? Emma asked. Lydia looked around at the faces of the people who'd stood with her, who'd risked their livelihoods and safety to fight for something better. No, she said. We keep pushing, keep organizing, keep holding them accountable. She paused. But we also recognize that we've won something here. People stood up, spoke out, forced the powerful to change their behavior. That matters. So what's next? Mary asked. Next, we make sure these new policies are actually enforced. We document everything. We support families who are still struggling, and we build something that lasts beyond just this moment. Over the following months, that's exactly what they did. The loose coalition that had formed around fighting foreclosures became a formal organization, a farmers' cooperative that pooled resources, shared information, and provided mutual support. It wasn't perfect. There were disagreements, setbacks, families who still lost their land despite their best efforts. But it was real, and it was theirs. Lydia found herself at the center of it, not because she'd sought leadership, but because it had grown naturally from her refusal to stay silent. She learned to navigate town politics, to negotiate with business owners, to organize meetings and manage conflicts. And through it all, Caleb was there, not leading beside her. He was too private for that, too uncomfortable with public attention, but supporting her, offering advice when asked, providing resources when needed, being the steady presence she could return to when the work became overwhelming. Their relationship shifted gradually, the careful distance replaced by something warmer. They talked more, shared more, learned each other's rhythms and habits. It wasn't the romance of storybooks. There were no dramatic declarations, no perfect moments of realization. It was quieter than that, more real. One evening, 6 months after the confrontation at Margaret Sullivan's house, Lydia sat with Caleb on their porch watching the sunset. It had become a ritual, this quiet time together at day's end. I was thinking, Caleb said slowly, about the deed I gave you. Lydia's stomach tightened. What about it? I gave it to you so you'd have the freedom to choose, to stay or leave based on what you wanted, not what you were forced into. He looked at her. Have you decided? I decided months ago. She met his eyes. I'm staying, not because I have to, because I want to. Even knowing I'm not. I can't be what most husbands are. I can't give you romance or grand gestures or... Caleb, she stopped him. I don't need those things. I need partnership, respect, someone who sees me as an equal. She paused. Someone who gives me freedom instead of taking it away. You do that, that's enough. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, a simple gesture they'd grown comfortable with over the months. I know I'm not easy to live with, he said. I'm too quiet, too caught up in my own head. I have days where I can barely function because all I can think about is Sarah and Emma and everything I lost. I know, but when you're here, it's easier, like I can breathe again. His hand tightened on hers. I may not be good at saying it, but I'm grateful. For you, for what we've built. It wasn't a declaration of love. But coming from Caleb, guarded, careful Caleb, it meant everything. I'm grateful too, Lydia said softly, for the chance to choose my own life, even if it took being sold to get there. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The final confrontation came on a Sunday, 8 months after Lydia's outburst at the church social. The Reverend had announced that Caleb and Lydia would be speaking after services, a public acknowledgement that many in the congregation had interpreted as an apology or reconciliation. The church was packed. Everyone wanted to see what Lydia Cross Boone would say. Margaret Sullivan sat in the front pew, her face carefully neutral. The Hendersons and Cartwrights flanked her, a show of unity from Red Hollow's elite. But the rest of the church was filled with ordinary families. The Mitchells, the Clarks, the Martins, who'd managed to keep their home thanks to the new lending policies. Dozens of others who'd been part of the organizing efforts. The Reverend introduced them with obvious discomfort. Lydia stood with Caleb at her side and faced the congregation. For a moment she was back in that borrowed wedding dress, standing in this same spot, saying "I do," like a surrender. But she wasn't that girl anymore. "Most of you know my story," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the church. "I was sold in a marriage arrangement to pay my father's debts. I stood right here and said vows to a stranger while the whole town watched." A ripple of discomfort moved through the pews. "I'm not here to apologize for what I said about that. It was the truth then, and it's the truth now." She paused. "But I'm here to talk about what happened next." She looked at Caleb, who gave her an encouraging nod. "When I arrived at the Boone Ranch, I expected to be treated as property, as something bought and owned. Instead, I found—" She searched for the right words. "I found someone who gave me a choice, who saw me as a person, not a transaction." She pulled out the deed from her pocket and held it up. "This is ownership of 200 acres of the Boone Ranch. Water rights, grazing rights, everything. My husband gave it to me freely, with no conditions because he believed I deserved to own something, to have security that didn't depend on anyone else." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Margaret Sullivan's face went rigid. "I'm showing you this," Lydia continued, "because I want everyone here to understand something. Power isn't just money or land or social position. Power is the ability to make choices, to control your own life, to have a voice in how things are run." She looked directly at Margaret. "For too long, a few families in this town have had all the power. They've made decisions that affected everyone else without input or accountability. They've profited from other people's struggles and called it business. And we accepted it because we thought that's just how things were." Her voice strengthened. "But it doesn't have to be that way. We can organize, support each other, hold the powerful accountable. We can demand fair treatment and refuse to be silent when we don't get it." She paused. "That's what the past 8 months have proven. That ordinary people, when they work together, have more power than they think." She turned to Caleb, who stepped forward. "I'm making this deed public," he said, his voice quieter than Lydia's but no less firm, "so everyone understands what I'm about to say. My wife is not my property. She never was. She is my partner." He looked out at the congregation. "And I want all of you to witness this. Lydia Boone owns half of everything I have. She has equal say in all decisions affecting our land, our home, our future. Not because I'm being generous, because it's right. Because marriages should be partnerships, not ownership." The church was absolutely silent. "If that makes us strange or improper in the eyes of this town," Caleb continued, "so be it. We'd rather be honest than acceptable." Lydia stepped forward again. "I came to this marriage with nothing. No money, no options, no control over my own life. But I'm not leaving it that way." She met the eyes of the families who'd stood with her over the months. "None of us have to accept powerlessness. We can fight for something better. We can build something new." She looked at Margaret Sullivan one final time. "That's not an apology. It's a promise. We're not backing down. We're not going away. We're here, we're organized, and we're going to keep pushing for change until Red Hollow becomes a place where everyone has a fair chance, not just the wealthy." She sat down. Caleb sat beside her. The silence stretched for a long, painful moment. Then someone in the back started clapping. Lydia turned to see John Mitchell on his feet, applauding. Helen joined him. Then Emma and her father. The Martins. The Clarks. One by one, families stood and applauded until more than half the church was on its feet. Margaret Sullivan sat rigid in her pew, her face a mask of fury and defeat. The Reverend looked between the standing families and the seated elite, clearly unsure how to proceed. Finally, he simply dismissed the service early. Outside, people surrounded Lydia and Caleb, shaking hands, offering support, sharing stories of their own struggles and small victories. Mary pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around Lydia. "That was incredible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were incredible." "We were incredible," Lydia corrected. "All of us." As the crowd gradually dispersed, Lydia and Caleb walked back to their wagon. The sun was bright, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. "Think we've finally burned all our bridges?" Caleb asked. "Probably," Lydia laughed. "But I don't care. Do you?" "Not even a little." They climbed onto the wagon and headed home, toward the ranch that was now half hers, toward a future they'd built from the ruins of a forced marriage, toward a partnership that had been forged in desperation but had become something real. It wasn't perfect. There would be more fights, more struggles, more days when the weight of what they'd started felt too heavy to carry. But they'd face it together, as equals, as partners, as people who'd learned that freedom was something you claimed, not something you waited to be given. And that, Lydia thought as the ranch came into view on the horizon, was worth every risk they'd taken. The girl who'd whispered, "I do," like a surrender, had learned to speak with a voice that couldn't be silenced, had learned that power came not from what you owned, but from what you refused to accept, had learned that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was simply choose yourself. She'd been sold, but she'd bought herself back. And in doing so, she'd shown others how to do the same. That was the real victory. Not the deed or the confrontation or the policy changes, but the understanding that spread through Red Hollow and beyond, that ordinary people, when they stood together and refused to be silent, could change the world. One choice at a time, one voice at a time, one person at a time, deciding they deserved better and being brave enough to fight for it.